She lay crumpled on the floorboards, wrists bound so tight the rope had left marks deep enough to last a week. Her dress was ripped at the collar, and dark patches were already spreading across her forearms where someone had made sure she stayed down. Caleb Rourke came through the doorway at a low run, blade already drawn. Afternoon sun flooded the room behind him, and nobody was riding up to pull him back. Her breathing came shallow and ragged, each inhale sounding like it cost her something. He looked at all of it directly, the bruises, the rope, the fear, and his hand went straight to the knot at her wrists, working it apart with quick, practiced cuts. Out front, a horse stood saddled and waiting in the heat, patient and still. Inside, the house held the kind of silence that settles into places where wrong things happen too often. Then she spoke, barely a thread of sound. "I can't keep pretending it doesn't hurt." Caleb had watched men die slow on cold ground before, but this kind of quiet was different. A home wasn't supposed to feel like a trap. The rope had been cinched so hard it had broken the skin underneath. She looked less like a woman, and more like someone who had spent years learning how to survive being overlooked. Annie Greer pulled back when his hand neared her, not because of him, but because her body had learned to expect the worst from anyone who reached toward her. He noticed that. He noticed the bruises she tried to angle away from him, even now, even barely able to move. He took a moment to look her over carefully, just enough to understand where she was hurting most. "Tell me where it's worst," he said, voice low enough not to spook her. She tried to answer. Her voice shattered before the words came out, but her fingers found his sleeve and held on like it was solid ground. Behind him, Vernon Greer lurched into the room, whiskey rolling off him in waves. He jabbed a finger toward them both. "That's my roof," he slurred. "She stays where I put her." He said it the way a man talks about a fence post. "This doesn't concern you." Ida Greer stood against the far wall, arms folded, face unreadable like none of this was new to her. Caleb didn't respond. Not yet. He was still looking at Annie, still accounting for what had been done to her. Then Vernon bent down and grabbed her arm, pulling, trying to drag her back across the floor like she was something he'd misplaced. That was when Caleb stood. That was when his fist answered. "You put your hands on her again. You won't stand back up from it," he said. Quiet as a closed door. Vernon hit the boards hard. The sound of it rang through the whole room. Silence followed, sharp and total. Caleb lifted Annie carefully and walked her out through the door, past the waiting horse, past the hot summer air, without stopping to ask anyone's permission. He knew the talk would start before nightfall. A valley like Millhaven didn't let things go unnoticed. But he walked her out anyway, because he already understood one thing clearly. This wasn't just a woman hurting. This was a story that had been pressed down under floorboards for a very long time. And if he turned his back now, how many more mornings would she wake up on that same floor? She had told them she was leaving. Vernon had tied her down to make sure she couldn't. Caleb didn't take her to his own place. He was old enough to know how a story could get bent out of shape when people only caught the edges of it, and he wasn't going to hand anyone a reason to question what he'd witnessed. He drove instead toward the far end of town, where an older woman named Mrs. Pruitt kept a small, clean house that smelled of dried lavender and wood smoke. By the time they got Annie inside, her eyelids were heavy, but her grip on his sleeve hadn't fully let go. Not tight, just enough to say the world still felt dangerous. Mrs. Pruitt didn't push for details right away. She had lived enough years to know that some stories needed tending before they needed telling. She cleaned the cuts, assessed the bruising, and shook her head slowly. "A fall doesn't leave marks like these," she said under her breath. Caleb said nothing, but his expression confirmed she wasn't wrong. Annie rested through most of the afternoon, but her sleep wasn't peaceful. Even lying still, her body kept bracing. A small flinch at a door closing somewhere down the road, a tightening of her shoulders at the sound of boots on the porch. Her nerves hadn't gotten word yet that she was safe. Caleb sat outside on the porch steps, hat pulled down, listening to the wind move across the dry hillside. He wasn't someone who went hunting for other people's difficulties. People in Millhaven could have told you that much. But every so often something happened that a man couldn't fold up and carry past. Later, when Annie could sit up with a cup of tea in her hands, she started talking, not all at once but in pieces, the way someone speaks when they've spent a long time not being listened to. She told him about Daniel, her husband. how he had been nothing like his father. He'd had quiet plans, a small parcel of land he wanted to farm honestly, a doorstep where Annie wouldn't have to make herself smaller every time someone older walked in. He used to say a woman ought to feel like she belonged in her own home. He never got the chance to build that. One morning, a ride toward the upper ridge, a bad fall on a steep trail, and then he was gone. That was what everyone had been told. Annie set down her cup when she got to the next part. The night before he died,
He told his father we were leaving, she said.
her voice dropping to nearly nothing. Caleb leaned forward slightly, and Vernon told him that nobody left that house without his say-so. Mrs. Pruitt stopped moving in the background. Annie swallowed. Then she said the part she'd kept buried deepest. The morning Daniel died, she said slowly, his father saddled the horse for him. Caleb didn't move for a long moment. Then his eyes shifted, narrowing just slightly beneath his hat brim. Because out here, one man didn't saddle another man's horse, not without a reason. And the reasons were never simple. Caleb didn't sleep properly that night. He sat out on Mrs. Pruitt's porch until the stars moved a good distance across the sky. The quiet felt different from the usual kind, less like rest, more like something coiled and waiting. He kept turning it over. A man saddling his son's horse. That wasn't care. That was control wearing the mask of it. Just after first light, he rode out to the ridge trail where Daniel had died. The summer heat was already climbing before the sun had fully cleared the hills. The land looked still, peaceful in the way that land always looks, unbothered by what it's witnessed. Caleb found the spot without much trouble. The kind of place a death leaves a mark on, even when you can't name how you know it. He walked the edge of the trail slowly, eyes near the ground, taking his time. Truth didn't reward rushing. The terrain itself told part of the story, steep enough, rough enough, unforgiving enough that a compromised saddle strap wouldn't last long under any real weight. But there was nothing left there. Wind and sun had done their work, so he turned his horse and went back toward the Greer barn, arriving in that quiet stretch just before dusk when nobody was around to notice. That was where he found it, a saddle strap, one that had been replaced but not carefully enough. The original cut was still visible if you knew what to look for, clean, precise, deliberate, not the kind of fraying that came from age or wear. He held the leather in his hands and felt the edge with his thumb. That line had been made with a knife. Not time. He didn't say it out loud. His jaw simply set a little harder because now the story had shifted completely. This wasn't bad luck. This was a man's anger and pride colliding with one terrible decision he could never pull back. That, in Caleb's view, was the ugliest kind of thing. Not calculated, not cold. Just a moment of fury that ended a life and buried the truth under grief and silence. Back at Mrs. Pruitt's, Annie was sitting up by the window wrapped in a wool blanket, watching the road like she was still waiting for the past to arrive. Caleb came in and placed the leather strap on the table in front of her. She looked at it for only a moment. Her face didn't break. It just shifted, slowly, quietly, like something that had been out of alignment for years was finally settling where it belonged. He adjusted the saddle himself that morning, she said. Barely a whisper. Caleb nodded once. That was all it needed to be. Sometimes the truth doesn't require a long speech. It just needs the right pieces set down in the right order. He leaned against the wall and thought it through. If Vernon had done this in a fit of rage, and Martha had known, then everything that came afterward wasn't just cruelty. It was a wall built to hide what was underneath, and people who built walls like that didn't take them down willingly. By late the following afternoon, the valley had gone heavy and still again. Caleb was stacking firewood behind Mrs. Pruitt's house, more out of habit than necessity, eyes drifting to the road every few minutes. Men like Vernon Greer didn't absorb humiliation quietly. They came back with something to prove. Annie had changed, though. She still moved carefully, still favored her left side, but there was something different in the way she held herself. Less braced, more present. Like knowing the truth, even a hard one, gave her somewhere solid to stand. The sound came just before sundown, 2 sets of hooves riding in faster than a social call. Caleb set down the axe. Vernon dismounted stiffly, sober this time, which made him sharper and more dangerous. A younger ranch hand pulled up behind him, the type who followed orders and skipped the questions. Vernon held a folded sheet of paper in one fist. "She comes back with me," he said, tight-jawed, controlled. "Or she puts her name on this and we call it done." Mrs. Pruitt appeared on the porch but stayed quiet. This wasn't hers to interrupt. Annie came to the doorway on her own. She looked at the paper. She looked at Caleb, then she looked at Vernon. "What does it say?" "That you left without cause," Vernon answered. "That you weren't touched, and that this man here dragged you out of your own home like a common thief." A beat of silence. "No," Annie said. That single word landed like something thrown. Vernon moved fast, reaching for her arm. Caleb moved faster, stepped in before contact was made. The ranch hand swung from behind, catching Caleb in the ribs. The air punched out of him, but his footing held. He turned, drove his weight forward, and put the younger man down in the dirt. Vernon came in swinging wide, the kind of swing that came from fury rather than any skill. Caleb absorbed it, took a breath, and put Vernon down with one clean return. It was over quickly. It didn't need to be long. Annie walked forward. She crouched and picked the paper up from where it had fallen. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but from something building past it. She tore the paper down the center, then tore it again. She let the pieces fall at Vernon's feet. "You don't hold the deed to my life," she said, quiet, clear, like something she'd been saving for a long time. Vernon dragged himself up, breathing hard, eyes burning, and then Ida spoke. Something in the moment cracked her composure open, and her words came out sharper than she intended. If Daniel had just signed the land over the way his father asked, none of us would be standing here right now. The air stopped. Annie turned slowly. "What did you just say?" Ida's face tightened, the color shifting, the realization of what she'd let slip settling in too late. She pressed her lips together, but the words were already out, and in a place like Millhaven, words spoken out loud don't go back to being secrets. What Ida had said didn't dissolve in the air. It stayed, heavy and real, the way certain admissions do. Not because they were meant as confessions, but because they carried the full weight of everything that had been hidden behind them. Annie didn't fall apart. She stood and looked at the woman who had helped shrink her world down to nothing, not with rage, not with tears, but with the quiet clarity of someone who finally understood every piece of the picture at once. Caleb watched her and said nothing. There are moments that belong entirely to the person living them. Ida didn't crumble. People like her rarely did, but her silence was its own answer, and in that silence, the cover she and Vernon had maintained for years developed a crack wide enough for daylight to pass through. Word found its way across Millhaven the way it always does in a small valley. Not announced, just absorbed. By the following week, people knew more than they said aloud. Vernon's presence in town became something people worked around rather than engaged with. Men who used to do business with him found other directions to walk. No one held a formal judgment. No one needed to. Out in country like that, a man could feel the ground shift beneath him long before anyone said a word to his face. Annie didn't go back. Not for clothes, not for keepsakes, not for the name. She stayed with Mrs. Pruitt and healed slowly. In the way real healing moves, forward, sometimes sideways, occasionally back, but always gaining something. Caleb came around now and then, staying only as long as was useful, never asking for more than she had offered. One evening, several weeks later, when the worst of the summer heat had finally eased off, Annie walked out to where he was reinforcing a loose fence post near the edge of the property. She didn't say much at first. She stood beside him for a moment. "I think I've stopped waiting for it to get bad again," she said. Caleb set the post and pressed the dirt firm around the base. "Takes a while to believe it," he said. She didn't step back. For the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she chose where she was standing. Caleb didn't move toward her. He simply stayed there, steady, beside the fence, giving her the one thing nobody in that house had ever thought to offer: a choice. Stories like this one don't always arrive wrapped up cleanly. In the real world, people carry weight longer than they should. They stay quiet past the point of reason. Sometimes they've been told so many times that what they're enduring is normal that they've started to believe it. But every so often, one person says enough. And that changes the shape of what comes next. Not immediately. Not without cost. But enough to turn a locked door into a road that leads somewhere different. I've always believed a person isn't measured by how many times they managed to avoid hard moments, but by the one time they couldn't. Walk past one. So here's what I'd ask you to sit with. What would it take for you to say enough? If this story stayed with you, subscribe and leave a comment. Tell me which moment hit you the hardest. I'd genuinely like to know. And just so you're aware, this story was collected and retold with certain details reshaped to carry the lesson more clearly. All visuals are AI generated to support the emotion of the narrative. The title and thumbnail are designed